And before this video begins, I'd just like to give a special thank you to my Asbantium level patron, Fallon Cortez. Thank you for supporting the channel. Science fiction is one of the most popular and beloved media genres for very good reasons. It's endlessly expansive, with so much potential for stories and exploration. Some sci-fi media loves to take things extremely seriously, with a reverence of science and a dedication to making things as accurate as possible. Doctor Who, on the other hand, has about the same level of scientific accuracy as Jules Verne's A Trip to the Moon. And that's one of its greatest strengths. I mean, the main character is a shape-changing alien with 2 hearts and a time-travelling police box which is bigger on the inside, so it has never been a hard sci-fi, and that's what makes it so flexible and entertaining. But I feel like recently the show has started to stretch things a bit too far, and make some questionable decisions regarding its sci-fantasy approach, and using it too much as an excuse for weird things that don't make sense, or using it to handwave away plot contrivances and bad, weak writing. In isolation, this should be fine. It shouldn't be a real issue. Not everything needs to make sense or needs to adhere to science. Not everything has to have an explanation, but it does seem to be a growing issue, and I feel like I needed to talk about it in depth because it's really starting to bother me a bit. Due to its sci-fantasy nature, Doctor Who is no stranger to supernatural or fantastical happenings. Indeed, it has a long history of weird things going on, and I don't mean that one time Dracula and Frankenstein's monster showed up. There have been so many stories of mysterious monsters and dimensions that defy logic or human understanding. The Demons has, well, demons. The Time Monster, Celestial Toymaker, Enlightenment and Curse of Fenric have godlike beings, and then there's lots of mind-bending surreal happenings like Kinder and Snake Dance, the Mind Robber, Castrovalva and Ghostlight, and those are just examples from classic Who, with New Who being even more fantastical with its ghosts, zombies, vampires, witches and werewolves. But that makes it really interesting and entertaining because of how it stretches the boundaries of sci-fi and makes anything feel possible. It's a great benefit for a piece of media to have that kind of freedom, and it's something the show has been sure to positively exploit since the very beginning. But there's a big, crucial difference between a lot of these sci-fantasy stories and the more recent ones. They didn't take the piss. A significant part of those previous examples is the fact they have an easy explanation that still fits within the internal logic of the show. Those werewolves, witches, vampires and giant wasps are all just aliens that simply conform to our pre-existing mythologies, or in some cases they inspired them to begin with, like Sutekh the Destroyer. Of course, the godlike beings like Kronos, the Toymakers, the Eternals and Fenric are simply higher dimensional entities. Something easily understandable because of the nature of Doctor Who and its hierarchy of beings. There's very rarely been something that truly cannot be explained or contextualized within the boundaries of the show, so they don't feel too ludicrous and you can just accept it as truth. The explanation never needs to be really detailed or spelled out. You don't need a lot of technobabble to justify such fantastical and strange happenings. A lot of the time, a simple "they're aliens" or "it's another dimension" suffices and satisfies the audience because it just works. Doctor Who can do anything it wants because it has already earned that flexibility by always ensuring some level of rationalization and justification for all these impossible beings and happenings. Because at its core, Doctor Who is still a sci-fi show. It needs at least a little bit of science thrown in there every now and then to maintain its dignity and faithfulness to the genre it has and always will belong within at the end of the day. But all of this seems to have been completely undone with Salt. Yes, 2023 marked a sudden and drastic shift away from this rationalizing approach, with the show turning significantly more fantastical and unexplainable. The episode Wild Blue Yonder initially starts off as any other. The Doctor and Donna land on a mysterious empty ship, then they encounter beings capable of perfect duplication. They defeat these not things and then they go home. It's all very much what you would expect from Doctor Who, complete with those doppelganger entities being explained as things from the void. the emptiness between all universes. So there you go, something mysterious and impossible with a perfectly rational explanation within the laws and rules of the show. But the real issue stems from a simple scene of the Doctor testing a theory by using a line of salt to try and hold these entities at bay, suggesting they need to count every grain before they can cross. Of course, this turns out to be false, and the Not Things are able to continue their pursuit of the Doctor and Donna. But the Doctor invoking superstition at the edge of the universe turns out to be a significant turning point for the entire genre of the show. By doing this simple act, the Doctor unintentionally unleashes the Toymaker, one of those godlike beings I mentioned earlier. And that's fine, a nice consequence for doing something like this. But the problem is how it opened a Pandora's box of sorts, that the show is now using as an excuse to do anything it wants with little to no explanation, because it no longer feels like it needs to justify anything. So, at the edge of the universe, the rules are slightly more pliable, so superstition can lead to real consequences by freeing that godlike Toymaker. That's all fine, no issues there. All the shenanigans the Toymaker gets up to are surreal and mind-bending, but it's nothing we can't accept as possible within the Doctor Who universe. But then Series 14 takes a hard shift into outright fantasy with time-travelling goblins, constant fourth wall breaks, real witchcraft, and of course, the giggle casually introducing bi-generation. This is a mythical ability where the Doctor can regenerate by splitting into two. How does it work? What happens to the 14th Doctor afterwards? What actually caused it to begin with? Did it affect previous incarnations? All these questions are very important ones considering the huge shift bi-generation leads to, but the giggle doesn't take a moment to explain any of it, just hand-waving it away as fantastical, magical nonsense. And again, in isolation, this could be fine, but it's when these lack of explanations start to stack up afterwards, which creates a really frustrating and almost careless environment where the show decides it will do whatever it wants, like constantly breaking the fourth wall and then shooting down any criticism with, "Who cares? It doesn't have to make sense." A big example of this approach is that breaking of the fourth wall. Now, this is nothing the show hasn't already done before. As early as the Feast of Stephen, the Doctor has occasionally broken the fourth wall and addressed the audience directly, something the 4th and 12th Doctors have also done. So I have no issues with the 15th Doctor doing the same without explanation, because it's an established part of the character, an element that they like to talk to themselves sometimes. However, the issue arises with the character of Mrs. Flood, who breaks the fourth wall more blatantly and frequently than the Doctor has ever done before. She's a brand new character, at least right now, so her regular addressing of the audience doesn't have the same easy justification as the Doctor has for doing the same. I think my main concern is how it might never even be addressed to begin with. Showrunner Russell T Davies recently spoke about how Mrs. Flood will never be explained or resolved. Obviously, I'm inclined to not believe him because he's become infamous for these kinds of media obfuscations, like when he claimed Susan Twist was coincidental casting because they ran out of space for actors, which was always an obvious lie. But due to the increasingly laissez-faire approach to the show's internal logic, I am somewhat worried that even with her confirmed appearances in Series 15, Mrs. Flood's ability to directly address the audience will just be hand-waved away as yet another thing that doesn't have to make sense. And this is the growing issue that's making it harder and harder to care about new storylines in Doctor Who. Davies seems to have a very chaotic and bombastic approach to the show right now, believing nothing should be off limits and operating under an anything can happen approach, which isn't necessarily bad of course, but it doesn't seem to be a viable long-term strategy for the show, because if nothing has to make sense, then why care at all? When it soon becomes obvious that the writers themselves don't care for a sense of internal logic or consistency, why should the viewer care about the stories they write if we're no longer being given a reason to and we can't trust them to make it worthwhile? I think a notable example of this attitude of doing things for the sake of doing them is the musical number at the end of The Devil's Chord. This episode sees the Doctor and Ruby face off against a toymaker's child known as the Maestro, who can manipulate reality in the same ways as their father. But after the Maestro is defeated, everyone suddenly breaks into song and dance in a ridiculous way without any explanation within the narrative, since it was cut out by Russell and his production team. It turns out that really this big explosion of music is meant to be like the rules of the Toymaker still being active at the end of the giggle. You know, the thing that took them basically 2 seconds to explain. But in Devil's Chord, it's not explained. So it ends up another example of that infuriatingly common phrase, it doesn't have to make sense. Another big example of this approach negatively affecting my personal enjoyment of the show is 73 Yards, an episode that is essentially the poster child of the show just ignoring any rationality and logic in favour of fantastical, nonsensical storytelling. The episode features the Doctor and Ruby arriving in rural Wales, where the Doctor accidentally steps on a fairy circle and disappears, with Ruby spending the next 70 or so years being endlessly pursued by a mysterious old woman who remains exactly 73 yards away from her at any given point and can scare people away for unexplained reasons. That part is actually fine, by the way. I'm perfectly happy with not knowing what the woman is saying because we don't actually need to know for the story to work. It's more powerful and unsettling as a mystery. However, the real problem stems from the ending of the story, which seems to imply Ruby is her own stalker and is trying to influence events to stop the Doctor stepping in the fairy circle to begin with. Again, that's fine, but then you start asking questions about how, or questions about why she was always 73 yards away and why she needed to scare everyone away from Ruby, or how Mad Jack and Roger Ap Gwilliam actually figured into the events of it all. Rather than a good mystery like what the woman says to drive people away, 73 Yards ends up as a bit of an impenetrable riddle with no clear answer. And again, if you point this out to people, they will say once again that it doesn't have to make sense. A lot of people like to compare it to David Lynch's work, saying it's purposefully incomprehensible and explanations would ruin the atmosphere and the themes of it all. But when you look at Twin Peaks, for example, it's obviously very surreal and confusing, but everything that needs to be explained is explained. It's a world where demons and extra-dimensional locations are real, so with that rationalization in place, everything works. 73 Yards isn't like that. It forgets or outright refuses to rationalize itself because it desperately wants to have such an air of mystery around it. As I mentioned before, it's not about connecting dots to work out what really happened. The dots were never there to begin with, so fans have to bend over backwards to headcanon what they think actually happened without any outright confirmation in the episode or even a hint in the episode that adds up with other hints in the episode because it's all over the place. Don't get me wrong, 73 Yards is still a good episode, but it falls short trying to achieve a similar inexplicable mystery to episodes like Midnight and Listen, which leave you wondering what actually happened without leaving you unsatisfied. Midnight takes place on a planet that is utterly inhospitable, where literally no conceivable life can exist, yet we're introduced to a powerful entity that somehow can, and has incredible abilities even the Doctor struggles to understand and combat. It's a brilliant episode, especially because the ending leaves us wondering what the entity was and how it could possibly exist to begin with. But the events of the episode itself still form a tight, conclusive narrative that satisfies the viewer from beginning to end. And the Midnight Entity's existence is still rationalized within that narrative, with the Doctor chastising Professor Hobbs for acting like he has an absolute definition of life in the universe, leaving the possibility that the entity can indeed exist, but we just don't understand how or why because of our own limitations of knowledge. Listen is similar in that regard, weaving a rich character piece as the 12th Doctor tries to explore the possibility of a perfect predator able to live completely undetected. The episode ends without conclusive evidence of that, because all potential proof throughout the story has a rational explanation, but the journey we go on and both sides of the argument still have weight, so it all makes sense while still being so mysterious and incredible. And lastly, I want to point to another unexplained yet satisfying part of the Doctor Who mythos, the Beast. In Series 2's Impossible Planet 2-parter, we're confronted with a terrifying demonic entity trapped on an asteroid orbiting a black hole, able to influence minds and possess people, before it's revealed as being from before the universe itself. Rather than this being just a thing that exists, like Series 14 might hand-wave it away as, the story spends significant time exploring the impossible nature of such an entity, especially with its claim to be the devil itself, or the single root explanation for every religion's equivalent of such. The narrative explores how difficult these ideas are for the Doctor to believe, because it doesn't make sense to him, and that's a huge deal, especially the powerful ending as he admits he doesn't know what the beast was, and he doesn't even try to explain it, because he can't, which still rationalizes the entity within the boundaries of the show. There's a huge difference between this and 73 Yards, which doesn't even try to do anything of the sort, and the Doctor doesn't even know what happened. So the events are isolated, somewhat inconsequential, and the lack of explanation or sense is a byproduct, rather than an intentional, powerful narrative moment for the main characters and the world of the show itself. Something can be satisfactorily unexplained, without having to rely on the excuse of, you guessed it, it doesn't have to make sense. Doctor Who is in a weird place right now. It's attempting to change its genre identity to be more fantastical and offbeat, and that's fine. I'll never penalise it for that. However, by taking such a drastic change in such an accelerated time span, the show has opened itself up to some glaring issues. The new era of Doctor Who wants to tell grand tales of gods and impossible, unsolvable mysteries, but it hasn't earned that yet. It hasn't properly built up to it in the frame of its own era. It's sprinkled some salt in the middle of a trilogy and is relying on that one instance of superstition as the foundation for an entire era of such things. I don't mind unexplainable or fantastical happenings because, as I mentioned at the beginning, Doctor Who has never been cutting-edge sci-fi. Not everything has to make sense, but that's not something that could be used as an excuse, because it gets cheap and sometimes even a bit insulting to the viewer when every plot hole or writing flaw gets explained away as being intentionally unexplained and ambiguous. It's just getting a bit frustrating when so many of these new episodes are overlooking these kinds of fantastical things. I never want to be spoon-fed explanations, and I never want episodes to be bogged down in a lot of technobabble. But when you look at past examples like The Beast and so many other stories, you begin to realise just how much this new era is blundering plot points like these. It started to use mysteries and supernatural happenings as an excuse or a crutch for lazy writing, rather than making them impactful, purposeful elements like we've seen before. And that just disappoints me a bit. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. And I'd just like to give an extra special thank you to my Asbantium level patron, Fallon Cortez, my Diamond level patron, Glenna Clark, my Platinum level patrons, Matthew Burns and Maximilian Foreman, and all my Gold level patrons, Chris Douglas, Daniel Shillito, the 3 Railway Engines, and Thomas R. Thank you so much for your support.